Yeah.
Right here.
No, it's okay.
Paint a face on it.
Yeah. If you stand in a certain spot, you can see everything.
Yeah, you're perfect.
I want you to think back to the earliest moments of a romantic relationship. You know that time when you're like, you like the color blue? I love the color blue. And the clouds are making animal shapes just for you and for me, which is so much better than hopefully the time that comes much later on when you look across at your partner and you think, do you have to breathe that way? This story is about love, but it's also about when love falls apart. It's about marginalization, and it's about the art of reconciliation. And as you're thinking of this story and how it applies to you, you can think about interpersonally, like a romantic relationship. You can also think intrapsychically about things that you are trying to cast off in yourself or marginalize, parts of yourself that you find ugly, that you try to push down or push away, and how those might be retrieved. How many of us have gone through life thinking we're not quite enough, or having shame or having guilt, those ugly feelings that we try to push down. But this story can also be understood socioculturally between groups of people, and historically there have been whole groups of people who have been marginalized. How do we reintegrate them? The story is called Skeleton Woman. It appears in most northern cultures, and this particular version is an Inuit folk tale, and it begins like this. She had done something of which her father had disapproved, but no one could any longer remember what that was. And he had taken her to the far edges of the village, and he had thrown her off the rocky cliff, where her body cascaded down, down, down into the deep and unforgiving dark sea below, where her body broiled around, feeding abundantly the creatures who lived beneath. But it was a restless slumber, because she who had been wronged was roiling around on the bottom, so much so that she created foments in that part of the water. And the people of the village knew this, and they stayed away from that part because they said it was haunted with the unrest of the skeleton woman. Several years later, a very naive hunter moved to town, and he was out in his kayak and he was paddling along fishing right in those parts of the water where the skeleton woman lay beneath, roiling around. And what should his hook catch but right underneath the rib of the skeleton woman? And feeling the great weight of her on his line, he began pulling, and he thought, oh, thank Sedna, thank Raven, this is a massive fish. It will feed me and feed my people for many, many days. My life will be so much better. And he began pulling, but she who had been buried beneath, she who had been wronged, she who was thought of as ugly and undesirable and marginalized, did not wish to be brought to the surface. And so as he pulled from above, she pulled from below, and a great battle ensued, with him pulling up and her pulling down, so much so that his little kayak began bucking and bucking and bucking. But inch by inch by inch, he pulled her up to the surface, and he turned to get his net, so he did not see. So he turned around, the full vision of the skeleton woman with crustaceans on her teeth, barnacles on her skull, and she looked hideous. And he looked and he thought a monster had attached itself to his line, and he screamed, ah! And he picked up his oar and he began trying to beat her off because she was frightening. And he turned and he began paddling like a madman towards the shore, and she who had become entangled was right there behind, bumpity bump, bumpity bump. And when he looked back, it seemed like her arms were coming like this to grab him back down to the watery depths with her. And so he beached his kayak, he picked up his fishing gear, pulled on his mucklucks, and ran as fast as he could across the tundra. But she had already become entangled, and she who was entangled was right there behind. Bumpity bump, bumpity bump. And every time he turned and saw her, he ran faster and faster and faster until finally he saw the entrance of his snow cave, and he dove down in, and he sat, the great drum of his heart beating, boom, boom, boom. When it finally returned back to normal, he took a bit of hair and some whale blubber and some mint, and he lit a small fire in the center of his cave. And he sat as that light came up, and there in his very own cave, right across from him, was the mangled mess of the skeleton woman herself. Her knee was lodged up inside of her rib cage. Her arms were awry. All her bones were out of shape. Her spine was not as a spine's woman could be. And most eerily of all, her crustacean-covered head was just cocked eerily to the side. Well, perhaps it was the softness of the light. Or perhaps it was because he was a lonely man. But he suddenly felt compassion. And he got up on his hands and knees, and he walked across the cave, and he sat quietly beside her. And he began humming, almost like a grandmother would hum to a child. Na, 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 na. And he began unraveling his line that was all stuck around her body. Na, 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 na. Returning it to the spool, making order out of the chaos. Na, na, na. The skeleton woman dared not move for fear of scaring him. And when it had been returned to the spool, he pulled her knee out from her rib cage, and one by one, very patiently, he put her spine back as a woman's spine should be. He squared her shoulders, put her pelvis straight underneath, and the very last thing he did was he touched her face. He wasn't scared anymore. And he held it, and he put it back straight, how a woman's head should be. And tired now from his work, he crawled back across the cave and climbed into his furs and fell fast asleep. And a skeleton woman who had dared not move looked across the softness of that fire, and there in the corner of his eye, she saw a tear. The sort of tear one would cry if one had known great pain or great loneliness. And suddenly the skeleton woman was moved herself. And she got up on her hands and knees and clunkety-clunk, clunkety-clunk across the cave, and she leaned in, and there, that tear, she got closer and closer until she suddenly became so thirsty. She took a taste of that tear, and the saltwater truth of it just filled her soul. And she began sipping and sipping and drinking until her many years-long thirst was sated. And leaning in so close like that to his chest, she heard the great drum of his heart, ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. And that ancient rhythm gave rise to a song. Flesh, 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 flesh. And she sang herself legs with strong calves for running and toes for gripping. Flesh, 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 flesh. Ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. She sang herself wide pelvis for birthing and a long slender waist and pendulous breasts. Flesh, 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 flesh. Ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. And she sang herself hair dark like the deepest parts of the ocean, and eyes as reflective and wise as Raven herself. And when she had finished singing herself to life, She crawled into to the furs with him, and they were joined in a new way, which is the G version of what they did. And they awoke like that, entangled. And the people of the village say that they were abundantly fed by the creatures whom she had fed when she was beneath them. And they lived for a